So then we have, if I is equal to the square root of -1, then what is I squared? So if we look at some patterns, and we have been dealing with this with radical equations, that square roots and squareds just cancel out. So the square root of 3 squared is just 3. The square root of 2 squared is just 2. The square root of 1 squared is just 1. The square root of 0 squared is just 0. Hopefully you've picked up on the pattern now, and so you realize that the square root of -1 squared should in fact be -1. The square root of -2 squared is -2, and the square root of -3 squared is -3. You see the pattern. So the conclusion that we can draw here about I squared, which if I is equal to -1, so that would be this squared, then it's -1. So I squared is equal to the square root of -1 squared. Therefore, I squared is equal to -1. Which, and I'm sure you're wondering why you have to know this, there are some powers of I that are important. 0, 1, 2, 3, and that's it. So hopefully you remember anything to the 0 power is 1. And that will apply for I as well. Anything to the 0 power is 1, so I to the 0 power is 1. Here we have I to the first power. Anything to the first power is itself, which is I. I squared, we just learned, was equal to -1. And then I to the third power is -I. This one is a little weird. If you're really interested on Google Meets, I can explain it to you, but for the purposes and the time constraints that we're dealing with right now, I would just go with memorize this pattern right here, because after that it starts over. So I to the fourth power is 1, I to the fifth power is I to the sixth power is -1, I to the seventh power is -I. Again, 0, 1, 2, and 3 are important, and I will show you how to get all of the rest of them down to one of those 4 numbers. So, again, I to the 0 power is 1, I to the first power is I squared is -1, and I to the third is -I. So the way that most of you probably learned how to do this, or most of us have probably learned how to do this, is with long division. So you would say 15, which is the exponent here, and you're going to divide by 4 all of the time. That doesn't change. So 15 divided by 4, 4 goes into 15 3 times. 3 times 4 is 12, and then you subtract and you get a remainder. The remainder is the part you're looking for. It doesn't matter what your quotient is here. You only want to look at the remainder. So I to the 15th simplifies into I to the third. Then you check your list. I to the third is -I, so the answer is -I. We'll look at the second example, I to the 34th power. 34 divided by 4. 4 goes into 34 8 times. 8 times 4 is 32. When you subtract, you get 2. Again, we are just looking at the remainder, which is 2. So I to the 34th power simplifies into I squared. From our list, we see that I squared is -1, so the answer is -1. Some of you are at this point thinking, Miss Harvey, I haven't done long division since the 3rd grade. And that's valid. So there's also a decimal way that you can do this, which is kind of like a shortcut. So you can use your calculator. If you put the numbers in your calculator, so the exponent divided by 4, and you get no decimal, it is 1. If you get a decimal of 0.25, it is I. If you get a decimal of 0.5, it's -1. If you get a decimal of 0.75, it's -I. So here, on our third example, 104 divided by 4 is 26.0. I didn't write that down because you don't have to. So there's no decimal, which means it is equivalent to this first situation. So the answer is 1. On the 85, so I to the 85th power, 85 divided by 4 is 21.25. I'm going to look at my decimal, which is 0.25, which means it's equivalent to I to the first power, which means it simplifies into 1. Excuse me, into I, because anything raised to the first power is itself. And then finally, on the last one, anything to the 0 power is 1 all the time. So that seems clear as mud, right? Well, now we're going to do some negative exponents. If you guys will think back to negative exponents, answers cannot have negative exponents in them. And it means you move them in a reciprocal fashion. So if they're in the top of a fraction, you move them to the bottom. If they're in the bottom of a fraction, you move them to the top. So in theory, that's great, except for, in addition to not being able to leave radicals in the denominator, you cannot leave imaginary numbers in a denominator. So here we start with I to the negative 2 power. So when we rewrite that, we're going to write it 1 over I squared. We can't leave I squared in the denominator. Lucky for us, I squared is equivalent to negative 1 from our list. I squared equals negative 1. 1 divided by negative 1 is just negative 1. I'm going to skip number 2 for just 1 second and move over here to number 3. I to the negative 1 power is equivalent to 1 over I. This one is not as easy because we don't have I squared to cancel out by itself. So we have to make our denominator I squared. So to do that, we're going to multiply the bottom by I. It's a fraction, so anything we do to the bottom, we have to do to the top. So we have 1 times I, which is I, and I times I, which is I squared. Now we can look at it and say that I squared is negative 1. So the I on top stays the same, it's still I, and the I squared on the bottom becomes negative 1. So now we have I divided by negative 1, which is equivalent to negative I. The one in the middle is slightly more complicated because the number is a little bigger. It's not one of your first 4, so you have to simplify it at some point. So we're going to start with the negative exponent. I to the negative 11th power is 1 over I to the 11th power. We're going to simplify that by dividing it by 4. I showed you the decimal method here. 0.75 means it's equivalent to I to the 3rd. So we're going to have 1 over I to the 3rd. I to the 3rd from our list is negative I. So we have 1 over negative I. And then I move down here to the bottom because there's more space. So again, like we did in this example here, we have to rationalize the denominator with i's. So we're going to multiply the top and the bottom by I. 1 times I is I. Negative I, times I is negative I squared. The I on the top stays the same, and the I squared on the bottom becomes negative, so we have negative 1. A negative 1 is positive 1. I over positive 1 is just I. On your iExcel, it will really help you if you write these down. Once you get the hang of it, it works pretty well. Until then, it seems kind of silly.